In the brutal, war-torn 14th century, one woman's story of revenge is so intense it almost sounds like a myth. It's a story that proves vengeance has no gender and that grief can forge the most terrifying weapon imaginable. History is filled with powerful women whose true stories have faded into legend. So, let me introduce you to Jeanne de Clisson. She was a noblewoman, a wife, a mother, and a pirate. Imagine a woman declaring war on the entire kingdom of France, not a queen or a general, a grieving widow. This is the story of how a French noblewoman became the most feared pirate in the English Channel. All to avenge the man she loved. Before the blood and fire, before the black sails and cries of terror, Jeanne-Louise de Belleville lived a life of incredible privilege. Born in 1300 to high nobility, her world was one of sprawling estates and political marriages. Like most noble women of her time, her path was pretty much set from birth. At just 12, she was married off to a nobleman almost 20 years older, a standard deal to combine power and property. They had 2 kids, and for 14 years, Jeanne lived the life she was born into. When her first husband died in 1326, Jeanne became a wealthy young widow, making her an even more attractive prize on the feudal chessboard. After a second marriage that was quickly annulled, she was married to the man who would define not just her life, but her rage and her brutal legacy. His name was Olivier de Clisson. Their marriage in 1330 was, by all accounts, the real deal. In an age where love was a luxury most nobles couldn't afford, Jeanne and Olivier actually seemed to have found it. Their union wasn't just a merger of lands, they were a true power couple. Together, they had 5 children and built a life of what seemed like real happiness and immense wealth. And Jeanne wasn't just some lady of the manor. Through her husband, a respected military man, she was exposed to the strategies of warfare and the ruthless politics that went with it. These were lessons she was soaking in, unknowingly preparing for a future no one could have ever seen coming. But their world was built on a fault line. France and England were gearing up for a war that would last a century, and their home, Brittany, was caught right in the middle. The people of Brittany didn't see themselves as French or English. They were Bretons, and they were proud. Soon, a crisis over who should rule Brittany would erupt, dragging the de Clisson family right into the heart of the storm. In 1341, the Duke of Brittany died without an heir, creating a power vacuum. 2 men stepped up, Charles de Blois, who was the French king's nephew, and John de Montfort, who was backed by the King of England. This local fight, the War of the Breton Succession, quickly became a proxy war for the much larger Hundred Years' War. Every Breton lord had to pick a side, France or England. Olivier de Clisson, being a loyal friend to Charles de Blois, chose France. It was a decision that would seal his fate and start a chain reaction that would turn his loving wife into an instrument of pure, terrifying vengeance. The War of the Breton Succession was a messy, brutal conflict where loyalties could shift like the coastal fog. Olivier de Clisson, as a commander for the French side, was right on the front lines. In late 1342, he was defending the city of Vannes from an English attack. The battle was savage, and Vannes eventually fell. The English captured Olivier and threw him in prison. For Jeanne, this was terrifying. Her husband was a prisoner of war, his life hanging in the balance. But then something strange happened. The English suddenly released Olivier for a suspiciously low ransom. Now, to his captors, he was a major military leader, so why let him go so cheap? Olivier, probably just happy to be alive, rushed home to his family. But to his commander, Charles de Blois, and especially to King Philip VI of France, that low ransom wasn't luck. It was treason. They were convinced Olivier must have cut a deal with the English, that he didn't defend Vannes properly and had switched sides. The French king, Philip VI, was a deeply paranoid man. He saw traitors everywhere, convinced his own nobles were plotting against him with England. He was baffled and enraged by what he saw as constant disloyalty. Completely unaware of the suspicion hanging over him, Olivier accepted an invitation to a tournament in Paris in the summer of 1343. A truce had just been signed, and the tournament was supposed to be a celebration. It was a trap. As soon as Olivier arrived, he and 15 other Breton lords were arrested and thrown into prison. When Jeanne heard the news, she was frantic. She desperately tried to get him released, even trying to bribe a king's sergeant. But it was no use. The king had already made up his mind. There was no evidence, no trial, just the king's suspicion and his cold, swift sentence. On August 2nd, 1343, Olivier de Clisson was found guilty of treason. He was taken to the public markets of Les Halles and beheaded on a crude scaffold. For a nobleman, that alone was a dishonorable death. But King Philip wasn't done. He wanted to make an example of Olivier. He ordered Olivier's headless body to be hung by the armpits from the highest gallows in Paris for everyone to see, and his head was sent to the city of Nantes in Brittany to be stuck on a spike above the main gate. This is the moment everything changed. When news of her husband's execution and the grotesque display of his head reached Jeanne, something inside her didn't just break, it hardened into steel. Her grief was instantly replaced by a white-hot, all-consuming fury. This wasn't justice. This was murder by a paranoid king. She took her 2 young sons, Olivier and Guillaume, on a grim trip to Nantes. She stood them before the city gate and made them look up at the rotting head of their father. She forced them to burn the horrific image into their minds, letting their horror curdle into a shared generational hatred. And she told them exactly who did this. King Philip VI of France and his puppet, Charles de Blois. In that moment, standing in the shadow of her husband's desecrated remains, Jeanne de Clisson made a vow. She swore a terrible oath of vengeance, not just against the men responsible, but against the entire French nobility and the crown itself. The lady of the castle was dead. The Lioness of Brittany was about to be born. Jeanne's transformation was immediate and total. All the energy she once put into her family was now aimed at one single, burning goal: revenge. She went back to her lands, not to mourn, but to prepare. She started selling everything: the de Clisson estates, her own lands, her jewelry, all of it. With the money, she raised a small army of men still loyal to her husband, men who were just as outraged by the king's treachery. Her first taste of vengeance was on land. She led her force to a castle loyal to Charles de Blois. The soldiers there, knowing her only as the noble lady of Clisson, opened the gates for her. That was a fatal mistake. Once inside, her army slaughtered the entire garrison. Her war had begun. But Jeanne knew she couldn't win a war against a king on land. The French army was just too powerful. Her war would have to be fought where France was vulnerable, at sea. With the massive fortune she'd raised, Jeanne went to the coast and bought 3 of the finest warships available. She had them refitted for battle, then gave them a terrifying new look. She had all 3 ships painted pitch black. Their sails were dyed a deep blood red. She named her flagship simply and chillingly, My Revenge. This was the birth of the Black Fleet, a specter of death that would haunt the English Channel for more than a decade. Now, before we get into the 13 years of carnage that Jeanne unleashed, if you're finding this story of historical revenge as gripping as I do, make sure you hit that subscribe button and ring the bell. You don't want to miss the other incredible stories we dig up here. Jeanne de Clisson was now a pirate, but she wasn't after treasure. She was on a mission. Her crew was fiercely loyal, and the military knowledge she'd picked up from her husband made her a brilliant and ruthless commander. She allied herself with the English, not because she liked them, but because the enemy of her enemy was her friend. She essentially acted as a privateer for England, using her ships to supply their armies, and more importantly, to shatter French naval power. She hunted in the English Channel, using her fleet's knowledge of the treacherous Breton coastline to launch lightning-fast surprise attacks on French merchant ships. Her tactics were brutally simple and brutally effective. The Black Fleet would swarm a target, and her crew would swarm the decks, swords and axes ready. But it was what happened after the battle that built her legend. Jeanne didn't care about cargo. Her prize was French blood, specifically the blood of nobles. Any aristocrat found on a captured ship was given no mercy. Legend says Jeanne would often grab an axe herself and personally behead the French nobles she captured, a grim echo of her husband's fate. Their bodies were then tossed into the sea. She was a master of psychological warfare. After slaughtering the crew of a French ship, she would always leave 1 or 2 sailors alive. These terrified survivors were sent back to port with a chilling message for King Philip. The Lioness of Brittany has struck again. Her name spread like a plague through the port towns. Fishermen and merchants whispered about black ships with red sails and the vengeful woman who commanded them. The French Navy hunted her relentlessly, but for years she was a ghost, her fleet vanishing back into the mists and jagged coastlines she knew so well. Her bloody campaign lasted for 13 years. She kept fighting even after King Philip, the man who started it all, died in 1350. Her hatred didn't die with him, but the sea, the instrument of her revenge, eventually took a price from her too. At some point, the French Navy finally managed to trap her fleet. In the battle that followed, her flagship, My Revenge, was sunk. Jeanne escaped the sinking ship in a small boat with her 2 sons and a few loyal men. For 5 agonizing days, they were adrift on the open ocean with no food and no fresh water. On the 5th day, her youngest son, Guillaume, died in her arms from exposure. It was another devastating blow. They were eventually rescued by English allies and taken to safety. Losing her son and her flagship might have broken anyone else. For Jeanne, it seems it only hardened her resolve. She kept on fighting for several more years. Around 1356, after 13 years of piracy, Jeanne de Clisson finally put down her axe. The fire of her vengeance had finally started to burn out. King Philip VI was long dead. Charles de Blois, the other man she hated, was still alive, but maybe the death of her own son had finally taken its toll. Or maybe after terrorizing an entire kingdom for over a decade, she just felt that her husband had well and truly been avenged. She retired from piracy and sailed to England. There, she married for a 4th and final time to an English knight named Sir Walter Bentley. After their marriage, she and her new husband returned to Brittany and settled down. And there, in 1369, Jeanne de Clisson, the Lioness of Brittany, died peacefully. She had outlived the king who murdered her husband and the life of vengeance she had carved out for herself on the high seas. But her story didn't end there. She became one of the most feared female pirates in history, a rare woman who not only joined the male-dominated world of piracy, but commanded it with unmatched ferocity. The image of her black fleet with its blood-red sails became a symbol of a woman's wrath. Her thirst for vengeance also lived on in her surviving son. Olivier de Clisson, the boy who was forced to stare at his father's severed head, grew up to be a fearsome military commander in his own right, earning the nickname the Butcher. After fighting for the English for years, he eventually switched sides and rose to become the highest-ranking military officer in all of France. He finally saw the end of the War of the Breton Succession, fighting in the battle where Charles de Blois, the man his mother despised so much, was finally killed. Jeanne de Clisson's story is a raw testament to the power of grief and rage. She was pushed past her breaking point and answered not with tears, but with fire and steel. She refused to be a victim and instead became the master of her own terrifying destiny, etching her name, the Lioness of Brittany, into history with the blood of her enemies. From a life of comfort to a crusade of chaos, Jeanne de Clisson's journey is one of the most extreme revenge stories ever told. She torched every rule for women of her time, trading silk gowns for a sword and a castle for a captain's cabin. So, what do you think? Was Jeanne a monstrous villain or a righteous avenger? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. And if you enjoyed this trip into the blood-soaked pages of history, don't forget to like this video and subscribe for more stories of the most incredible people you've probably never heard of. Thanks for watching.